TeraFlex has built one of the most innovative ball joints on the market.
You can say that again.
TeraFlex has built one of the most innovative ball joints on the market.
We're going to be serious about this.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
This is an important install video. These people need to know how to install these ball joints. They need to know how to put them in right.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let's continue. I'm sorry.
Okay, we're going to continue?
Yes.
In fact, they solved many of the original equipment ball joint woes and introduced some innovations from TeraFlex that are unique to the market.
TeraFlex uses the tool steel slotted wear plate between the ball, stud, and ball joint housing.
You forgot to say 4140.
Oh yeah. What is that anyway?
It's a metal hardness thing. They last a long time.
Oh, that's weird because I was just going to say these things have a lifetime guarantee.
It's probably the last set of ball joints you're ever going to have to install, but you do need to install them correctly.
Yeah, that's true. Even if you've installed ball joints before, you really need to listen to this guy, Mr. Wood, and his very wise counsel.
First off, do the standard lift the Jeep, be all safe, and get the tires off it. For tow safety, throw in a lug nut, just to keep that rotor from dropping. Release the ABS wiring harness from its brackets. Remove the two 21mm anchor bracket bolts. Remove the entire assembly and support it out of the way. Right now you're glad that lug nut was holding the rotor, but it's now time to remove it, as well as the rotor. Use the same 21mm and loosen, but don't remove the nut completely from the tie rod end. Use a hammer and knock it loose. This is really the best technique, and it's satisfying. Go ahead and hit the exposed threads of the 3 unit bearing bolts with some penetrating oil, especially if you live in a rust zone. Turn the knuckle to access those 3 13mm 12-point unit bearing bolts. They're usually pretty tight, so if you have to, break them loose and then wind them out. If you're lucky, you can now remove the axle and unit bearing as an assembly. Chances are, it's not going to happen. Just reinstall the bolts and wind them back in so there's plenty of thread engagement. Now I usually use my fully warrantied snap-on socket over the bolt head to protect the bolt while I knock the bearing loose. It's easy to damage the socket engagement surface on the bolt, so be careful. Work from side to side with the hammer until the bearing is free enough to remove. But don't remove it just yet. With the bearing loose, it'll make it much easier to remove that wheel speed sensor because the backing plate's out of the way. Use a 5mm Allen and remove the speed sensor retainer bolt. Carefully remove the bearing and axle shaft as an assembly. The axle shaft should have at least one nylon support on it when the axle is completely removed. If you don't see any, look inside the axle tube just to make sure it didn't come loose and get wedged in the tube. Remove both the upper and lower ball joint cotter pins. Use a 15/16 socket on the lower nut and a 7/8 on the upper. With the upper nut removed, I just reinstalled the retainer onto the harness so that I wouldn't forget about it or its orientation. Now don't completely remove the nuts until the ball joints are broken loose. Use some gentle persuasion. At this point, you will need a ball joint press. Now there's parts houses that will rent them or even loan them, but if you're doing this little project on your own Jeep, you really don't want to buy a ball joint press, because if you're installing the new TeraFlex adjustable ball joint, it's the first and last time you will use it. We removed the lower ball joint first. Now it pushes out from the top down. This allowed our ball joint tool to be used with an impact. To try to press them out by hand would take some serious time and effort. The upper ball joint will push out from the bottom up. Use style when actually lifting the ball joint out. Clean up the outer C so that the new ball joint will install into a good clean surface. Use a little grease to aid in a smooth install. Remember, the upper ball joint will install from the top down with the boot removed. We had to flip our press over to do the upper joint install because of the press design. Once it's seated, reinstall the boot. The lower ball joint has been shipped with 2 set screws installed, and 2 smaller set screws loose in the package. I'm going to install them now just because it's easy, but you could easily install them after the ball joint has been pressed in. The set screws just need to be good and snug. They are only there as plugs and for future adjustment. If you're all about Loctite, use some blue, just in case you do need to make some adjustments later. If you look closely, you'll see 2 large indentations in the outer edge of the housing. We'll talk about those in a minute. There's also 4 smaller marks located above each of the set screw holes. These smaller marks are used for an indicator for grease passage access. When an adjusting cap indexed mark lines up with one of the set screw holes, a grease passage is open and one of the longer set screws can be installed. Take a look at the 2 larger indexing marks on the very outer edge of the ball joint. These marks are directly across from each other and are used to orient the ball joint in the inner C. This is important, but it's not extremely critical as far as exact placement. Simply sight down the inner C and make a couple of marks. The marks need to be as close to parallel with the center line of the Jeep as possible. The goal here is to make sure that we have access to all of the set screws in the side of the ball joint when it's installed. They must face the outside of the Jeep. When the ball joint press is installed, it's kind of tough to see those alignment marks, so we added another mark centered between the indexing marks on the ball joint and the one that lines up with the outer C. Remove the boot and apply a thin layer of grease on the joint as well as the inner C. Install the joint and give it a little tap. It'll stay in place while you position the ball joint press. Press in the joint. And reinstall the boot. Just take a look and verify that you have access to all the set screws. Caution, don't forget to grab the spring for the boot from its package and install it. Your ball joints are shipped with the preload set. No adjustment should be necessary, but in the event that you'd like to make some adjustment, let's go through the adjusting process. Completely remove the 2 set screws that have the indexing marks aligned. Just loosen the remaining screws. TeraFlex offers a spanner type wrench for ball joint adjustment. It can be used with an inch-pound torque wrench. Set the tool to 90 inch-pounds. If the indexing marks don't exactly line up at the 90 inch-pounds, not to worry. Turn the indexing cap to the nearest point that the marks align. You may need to tighten or loosen the adjustment depending on which marks line up. If you're between 2 marks, round up. A pair of angled snap ring pliers will also work great. In fact, it may even be possible to make adjustments without any disassembly of the Jeep. Let's put it back together, and we'll start with the knuckle. When you install the upper ball joint nut, don't forget the ABS line bracket. It might get twisted up a bit when you tighten the nut. I just wedge a screwdriver to help hold it. It's not the end of the world if it moves. The torque spec on those ball joint nuts is about 70 to 80 pounds. If the cotter pin holes don't line up with the slot in that castle nut, just tighten the nut a little further until the cotter pin can be installed. Before we install the axle, make sure that your axle tube is clear of dirt and debris. When the axle is installed, all of that junk will wind up in the diff, and at the very least, ruin that inner axle seal. To help protect that inner axle seal, wipe some grease on the splines as well on the seal surface. The nylon washers will help guide the axle into the seal and help prevent damage. Before you finally install the bearing retainer bolts, install the wheel speed sensor. It's just a little easier with that backing plate loose. Final tighten the 3 unit bearing bolts. Reinstall the tie rod. A little pressure with the pry bar will keep that ball joint stud from spinning. Throw the rotor back on and don't forget that toe-saving lug nut. Slide the caliper assembly back on. Loctite and crank those bolts down. They need to be tight. $120 foot-pounds tight. Install the grease zert in the upper ball joint. Reinstall the wheel and tire. Now while we're here, let's show you how to grease that lower ball joint. Turn the wheel to gain access to the ball joint set screws. Now depending on how that ball joint is oriented, you'll need to turn the steering wheel all the way one way or the other. The way the ball joint is designed, one of those outermost set screws will always be greasable. Without even being able to see those indexing marks, we can tell which port to grease by simply removing one of the easily accessible set screws. If the one we remove is one of the longer locking set screws with the extended tip, we're good to go. Install the provided Zert extension and pump in enough grease that the boot will just start to expand. Don't overfill and blow out the boot. Replace the set screw, hit the upper ball joint with some grease, and we are done. Go forth and drive with confidence.